currently have 10 classes or small groups that are going to be offered for Rimrock Downtown. 10. The reason we did this, most churches only have like 20% involvement from their congregation. We're shooting for 50 because we are the church. And so we want to give you enough opportunity to hang out with other people, learn about parenting, learn about being a better spouse, learn about how to study the Bible. Also join small groups to get to know one another. And if these don't like pique your interest at all, create something on your own. You know why I say that so confidently? When I pulled up this morning at 8 o'clock, I saw a man out on the corner with a sign. I was like, that looks like Benny. Anybody know who Benny is? He's got tattoos on his face, like one of the friendliest guys you'll ever meet, but also one of the more striking appearances. Right? He's been coming down here for years now. He's standing out there with a sign that says, pray for addicts. On the back, it said 1 Corinthians 13:13, this idea that love is the most powerful thing we can do for people. We are the church. Never forget that. If you are a follower of Jesus, you got to be asking yourself, all right, God, what else do you want me to do besides just showing up on a Sunday morning? And as we study Joseph, you'll hear that exact same thing. We'll see it in his life as well. All right, there's my gentle intro. You guys bored of me already? I heard a cough out there. I saw a yawn. All right, so I got to pray. I got nothing to offer. Absolutely nothing. I've been up since 4. Oh. Spirit, I just give you access to my mind. Just because I have the mic, I invite you more powerfully into this space. We have free will, and so we surrender that to you right now. Teach us truth. Satan, if you're doing anything in this room, by the name of Jesus and his power, we cast you out. God, we give you the next 45 minutes of our lives. Amen. All right, so we're now in the 3rd week of our study of the life of Joseph and the choices that he made. Now, in order to make this more universal and applicable to us, instead of just focusing in on the choices, what I've really been honing in on are the perspectives that Joseph most likely had, the ways that he saw himself and the world around him. Out of these perspectives, this is where his choices would have naturally flowed. So in week 1, we looked at what I have labeled as a first principle perspective. That idea of first principle, we all have them. It means it's non-negotiable and it's foundational. And for Joseph, it had to be that God, he is sovereign. You know, as a teacher, I'm going to build you a pyramid. God, he is sovereign. That the God of the Bible is the creator of everything we know, and that life exists and only continues to exist because of him. In this worldview, our place in the universe, it is determined. God is God, and we are not. Because of this foundational perspective, every other perspective that a person has will be built off of it. When a person believes that God is sovereign and makes their choices out of that belief, then a second perspective that should naturally be established is that God and his ways are far better than me and my ways. Therefore, I should trust him and do whatever he wants me to do. Right? We saw this a couple weeks ago, but Isaiah 55 so clearly states this. I know I should have it memorized by now, but talk to the holes in my brain. I bet you somebody else is already stating it. God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor my ways your ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Last week, in looking at Joseph being seduced by Potiphar's wife, we saw that because he had these perspectives, that one, that God is sovereign, and two, that his ways are far better than anything else, Joseph was able to push back against his own desires and continually make the choice to not sleep with Potiphar's wife. He did this because ultimately he chose to trust God with all of his heart and to lean not on his own understanding. Proverbs 3. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your path. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be a healing for your flesh and a refreshment for your body. This week, we're going to get to see another layer added to Joseph's perspective pyramid from what we see the choices that he makes. God is sovereign, and because Joseph knows that he can be trusted, Joseph then seems to understand that God wants to use him to shine his light in a dark world. Even though life is not the way Joseph or really any of us would want it to be, it seems that Joseph understood that God still wanted to use him in the midst of the mess. As always, let's get into the Bible. This is where we really need to engage, not my words. And so last week, as we were looking at Joseph holding strong, right, against Potiphar's wife, right, we stopped when he made the appropriate choice. But as most of us probably know, because he made that choice, things got really, really bad. So we see this Genesis 39, verse 11 and on. One day, however, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she, Potiphar's wife, caught a hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought us among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to insult me.'" Verse 19, when his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Joseph remained there in prison. In this, we see a really important truth in this life. Just because we follow God, everything will not always go the way that we want or even need it to go. Right? We don't have time. Let me say that again. That word "need" slipped out and it shouldn't have. Just because we follow God, everything will not always go the way that we want or hoped it would go. Right? We don't have time to really unpack this, but let me give you a really quick explanation of why I believe that this happens. Because we live in a broken reality. When you look at the big picture story of the Bible, it clearly shows that God created a perfect world, and then humanity, what do? We broke it. Right? Instead of bailing on us, our Creator chose to become our Redeemer, which is amazing. But until Jesus comes back a second time and then restores everything back to its original design, bad things will continue to come our way. Even if we hang on to the proper perspectives and operate out of them, life will not only be full of good. And at times, like we see with Joseph here, things can get really hard. For well over a decade, he was either a slave or in prison, and he did nothing to deserve it. When things like this happen, it can cause people to ask an important question. If God is sovereign, then why would God allow me to go through this? A little side note before I give you my answer. If we have questions about our faith, we should ask them. God gave us big, beautiful minds for a reason. Don't just be that proper Christian that sits back and doesn't question anything, right? When questions come, right, use the brain and the resources that God gave you in order to seek them out. Because when you do this, even if you don't find crystal clear answers, right, because of the fact that you searched into it, you will be in a much more content spot with the answers that you find and the God that you want to continue to trust. But a really important part of this is who we turn to or what we turn to for resources. From a firsthand experience, I learned you do not want to dibble too much. What's that word? Delve too much into the dark side, right? They'll be confident and they'll give you the answers that they are sure are true, but they have faith just as much as we have faith. And I found if I spend too much time in that, then I get weighed down by their lack of hope and their despair. So ask questions, but just make sure you go to the right people to ask them to. So back to what we were looking at. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Right? Based on my understanding of our reality from 30,000 feet, I have comfortably landed on the answer that good people experience pain because we live in a world that we broke. We, people in general, we are the reason why bad things happen. And because God has given us free will, he allows us to experience the natural consequences of humanity's selfishness. If he didn't, then we would either be robots or, better said, spoiled children that can do whatever we want because everything will always be peachy keen. Joseph's story is a prime example of this. Why was he a slave? Because of his wicked brothers. Why did he get thrown in jail? Because of Potiphar's wicked wife. The broken people in Joseph's world are the ones who caused his pain. But it doesn't stop there. Because God chose not only to create us, but to also be our Redeemer, right? Life is not, man, this sucks, then I die. Instead, as a person goes through hard things, God can use the difficulties to bring about good. And that's a powerful statement that we can never let go of. And that's coming straight out of the Bible, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. Sadly, this is something that people either don't see because they don't look for it, right? They don't ask those questions and actually seek for the answers, or they are unwilling to see it because it doesn't fall in line with their cold and bitter view towards God. But over and over and over throughout the world, right? Bible and outside of it, we see God restoring what we broke. If you want to talk more about that question, it's a big one. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please come and find me, shoot me a text, whatever, we can meet up. But as we continue to study through Joseph's story, I want to focus it on the redemption piece of our reality. What I hope to show you is the ways that while Joseph was unjustly locked away, God still gave him the opportunity to be a much needed light into some individuals' lives who were buried in darkness. And then be used by God to bring his light into an entire subsection of a continent, the Middle East. And for this to happen, for Joseph to be able to be used by God, he had to hang on to and live out of those two perspectives that we talked about earlier. Let me say them again. God is the king of the universe, and he and his ways can be trusted. Now, let's start by looking at how Joseph hung on to these ways of seeing the world, even though his life was as low as it could get. I can't imagine it being much lower than that. So back in Genesis, if you got a Bible, please get there. Get you used to your own Bible. Genesis 39, kind of where we left off, verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph. One of the more powerful conjunctions, right? I love that connection of words, right? So often we see that, like bad things, but God. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, Joseph was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago when we were looking at Joseph's response to being thrown into a pit. But for Joseph to be so quickly put into a position of authority that he was in jail, he had to have a good attitude. Right? When most people are thrown into the king's dungeon because of nothing that they did, I think it's safe to assume that we would be overcome by frustration, anger, and then eventually despair. When someone is overwhelmed by despair, it affects who they are and their ability to do things well. Now, if Joseph had been in this mental state, there is no way in my mind that the chief jailer would have given him the power over everything. So for me, through my logic, this means that Joseph was most likely able to have a positive attitude, which means that he could work hard, be diligent with his responsibilities, and like we see, he could even be kind to others who were locked away. Chapter 40, verse 7. So Joseph asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody in his master's house, right, other men locked in jail, why are your faces downcast today? So instead of just being like, yeah, here's your meal, carry on, he's engaging with these other prisoners, noticing that they're in hard spots. Like I mentioned a few weeks back, I believe that a major reason why Joseph was able to keep his head above the water was because he was hanging on to these two essential worldviews. That God is king of our universe, and that he and his ways can and should be trusted. Through these ways of seeing the world, it would have allowed a Joseph to keep thoughts like, man, this is terrible, but God is allowing me to go through this. Because he is in control over everything, and I know that he can be trusted, then I must be being allowed to go through this for a reason. I hope you're understanding the concept that I'm trying to promote. What happens to us is only a small reason why our life goes the way it does. How we view and then respond to our circumstances has a much stronger influence on our lives than what we actually go through. I know that the verse I'm about to read isn't easy to hear when you're in a hard spot, but I guarantee this had to be on Joseph's mind when he was in jail. James 1. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy. I love that verb, consider. It's like your mindset, your perspective of it. Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that way you may become mature and complete, lacking in nothing. I believe because Joseph tightly clung to the proper perspectives, this is one of the reasons why it says that the Lord was with him and showed his steadfast love. And this does not mean at all that this earned God's love, right? And I'm not dismissing God's miraculous nature. But just because we have free will, the attitude that we have has a lot to do with the ways that God can and will work through us. Because Joseph was correctly seeing his reality, God was able to give him the hope that he wanted to give him, maybe even joy in the midst of suffering, which then has direct influence on his attitude. You know, I've been reading through on my own the minor prophets, and I came across this one yesterday. Habakkuk 3 just spoke so clearly to this. I hope you see, I just want to give you Bible more than any of my words. It's tons of Bible. Though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls. It's important to know this is an agrarian culture he's talking to. So this means like you're fired. You can't make any money. You can't bring anything into your house. Like you are cut off from all resources. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. You see that choice? I will exalt in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. That's why he trusts in him. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread on the heights. For us, this is a really important point of application. The power of hope. When we go through things that aren't easy, things that are even downright miserable, it is imperative that we hang on to the proper perspectives. I hope I'm hammering these into you. That God is in control and that he can be trusted. Now, I know this is far easier said than done. This is far easier said than done. This is why everyone must be committed and diligent in seeking God, as we are just as committed and diligent in seeking God as we are with the other things that we are passionate about, right? Like our profession or our hobbies. As we live in the midst of a broken world, in order to be able to hang on to the proper perspectives in the midst of any season of life, good or bad, we have to be continually bringing our eyes and hearts back to the one who is true, the one who does not change. I found 3 different verses from David. Seek the Lord and his face. Seek his presence continually. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Notice that action. Your face, Lord, I do seek. With my whole heart, I seek you. Do not let me stray from your commandments. Last one's from Jesus. Just don't miss the verb, but strive first for the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be given to you as well. I love these verses and the language that they use. I always have, even before I really even knew what it meant to seek God practically. But fortunately, at some point, my eyes were open, and I discovered that seeking the Lord with my whole heart, striving first for his kingdom, to do this, it means that I need to be continually committing my time and my efforts to prioritizing my God. If nothing else, walk out of here today with that word on your mind, priorities. Asking yourself, what are my priorities? And if you don't know, how do you spend your time? How do you spend your money? Then you will see clearly what your priorities are. Just for me, just like with climbing or biking, two things that I truly love to do. If I want to get better at those hobbies, what do? Climb and bike. Right? The more I do, the stronger I get. The same is true with my relationship with God. If I want to know him and his ways better, what must I do? Spend time intentionally seeking him. Now, this can come through an endless amount of things, like studying the Bible on your own or with other people, through reading a devotional, right? Coming together like this once a week is a powerful tool in seeking God. Right? It also, for me, comes when I pull away from the distractions and I seek God in nature. You can do it in any way, but what it ultimately requires is that you are intentional about giving your time to doing it. Maybe a better analogy for seeking the Lord with all of your heart would be your relationship with the closest person in your life, right? Your spouse, your kids, your parents, your best friend, whomever. In order to develop that relationship, what had to happen? You had to spend time together. Now, in order to maintain the depth and the strength of that relationship, what has to happen now? You have to spend time together. Man, I hope the point that I'm trying to make is obvious. In order to be able to hang on to the proper perspectives of our reality, which is essential to do, we must be intentional about elevating God and our relationship to the proper place, our top priority. To do this, we must give our time to our relationship with our Creator, Savior, and our Sustainer. Right? That's why the 21 days are brought out every year, to be very obvious. This is a good 3-week section in which you can elevate God. Should be more than that, but man, why not at least do it during those 3 weeks? Now, I have no idea if this is what Joseph did, but I believe he must have. There is no other way a human spirit could have hung on to a positive attitude in this level of hardship unless they had the proper perspectives on their life. The second thing that I've seen in studying through Joseph's time in prison is that when a person is able to maintain the proper perspectives, then God will be able to use them to accomplish his will for other people in their lives, even if they're going through really hard times. And from what we see in Matthew 22, right, according to Jesus, loving other people is a primary reason why God created us and saved us from our own stupidity. Let me show it to you. I'm sure you all know it. Matthew 22, verse 36. Teacher, talking to Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? Which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all your mind. That's what we've been looking at, seeking him with all of your heart. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This means that for whatever reason God allows us to experience pain, he still is giving us the ability to have purpose while we experience that pain. And I can't imagine I'm the only person in this room that's discovered that purpose is essential to my life. If I want to feel any form of contentment, I have to have purpose in my being. Right? We see this happening for Joseph in at least 2 different ways in Genesis 40 and 41. The first is with those fellow prisoners that we glanced at a little bit earlier. Let's just read a larger section. Genesis 40, starting in verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officers, the cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officer, who were with him in custody in the master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Oh man, please tell them to me. From what we just read in that last statement, I got to read it one more time. Do not interpretations belong to God? From what this shows us, regardless of the situation that Joseph was in, because of the perspectives that he held on to, right, he was able to see that God wanted to use him in the midst of that mess in order to shine his light into these individuals' lives. Right, if we keep reading, God gives Joseph the interpretation for both of these men. For the chief cupbearer, it's positive, and for the chief baker, it's real bad, right? His head gets cut off. But for us and our interpretation of this text, it doesn't matter if the dream was showing salvation or condemnation. What I want us to see happening is Joseph being used by God in order to bring these two men what only God could bring. As we keep reading, we see Joseph once again being used by God to demonstrate his love. This time, it's for an entire nation and really all the people throughout the Middle East. And this may be potentially overemphasizing my point, but why was Joseph able to do this? Because he held strong to the proper perspectives. Let me say them one more time. This may be the last, but maybe not. I don't know. Either way, God is in charge of everything, and he is worth trusting because his ways, they are far better than anything we can imagine. Let's look now at God saving thousands, maybe even millions of lives through Joseph. And when we get to chapter 41, this time Pharaoh has two dreams, and he can't find anybody that can interpret them for him. No matter how many of his wise men he calls to him or the magicians of Egypt, they are all stumped. And so we see, once again, God choosing to give Joseph a chance to love on others. You guys remember where Joseph is at? Prison. So he's still in the lowest spot of his life, and God now is giving him an opportunity to save an entire nation. I just do not want you to lose sight of that. So chapter 41, verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief bakers in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there, Joseph, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh." Did you guys see how Joseph had to first be cleaned up? Apparently, the Pharaoh's dungeon wasn't as nice as the prisons we have today. Right? It shows you the lot that he was in, where he had been for the last 2 years of his life. Now, if you were being brought out of this dungeon, brought before a man who had more power than anybody else in the country, one who had the ability to set you free and make everything right, what would be on the forefront of your mind? What would you be wanting to tell him? For me, I would be consumed by thoughts of self-preservation. I would want to scream out, "Let me go. I did nothing to deserve this. I can prove it to you that this was not me, it was someone else. Please set me free." But in the next verses, we see that Joseph was able to hang on to the perspective that God is in control and therefore he can be trusted and that God may want to use him in that moment to love on others. Verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Check out how Joseph answers Pharaoh. "It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." My goodness, that one-liner is blowing my mind. It continues to do so. It fully confirms that Joseph knew that God is king, that he is the only one that can bring us absolutely everything that we need. Therefore, instead of trusting himself, his own emotions, his own logic, he chose to trust in God and God alone. As we keep reading, God proves his faithfulness and gives Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams. Right? And through that, an entire nation of people are saved. Now, for me, the application has been that no matter what situation I ever find myself in, if I hold true to the proper ways of seeing my reality, then not only will it give me joy and hope during my darker days, which are so important, but it will also give me the opportunities to be used by God to shine his light into other people's lives. Now, I've learned that a major piece of me having the good life, and by good life, I'm not talking nice house, cars, any of that stuff. I'm talking being content, right? Just being like happy with what I have. And a major part for me being in that spot is having purpose. Floating through a day or two, it's okay. But very quickly, I get to the end of myself, and I'm just like, man, why am I even alive? Without that purpose, if I fall into harder times, the weight of whatever I'm experiencing gets even heavier. This is why what I'm learning from Joseph's story has become so important for me. When we see life through the correct worldview, even when sickness or poverty or disappointment or whatever comes our way, we can know that even though life isn't the way that we want it to be, God still has plans for me to love on other people, which will then give us a sense of purpose, which I have found that purpose can carry me through some of the harder days I've ever had. As I've been meditating on this truth, I ask God, you know what, it'd be nice to have a real life example of this. Joseph's is powerful, but somebody that we can more relate to. In such a short amount of time, he reminded me of a man named Steve Ballsley. Many of you may have known Steve. He was the head pastor of Rimrock for about 10 years before he died of cancer at age 56 back in 2016. Now, if my memory serves me right, about a year and a half before he died, Steve discovered that he had stage 3 esophageal cancer. Now, in order to combat that, he did many and extremely serious things, like having his esophagus removed. Right? He went through every possible choice he could in order to remove that cancer, but he was unsuccessful. And when Steve discovered that the cancer would most likely kill his earthly body, a question came to his mind. The reason I know this was just because of what he shared with me. He was asking himself, how should I end my life? Should I pull away from being a pastor, travel to beautiful places, spend time in comfortable settings with my family so that way I could maybe live a few months longer? Or should I continue to do what I feel like God has called me to do? To lead this church until the day I go home. Now, even if you didn't know him, I'm guessing you are assuming what he chose to do. He gave his last sermon 2 weeks before he went to hospice. And because he couldn't stand in front of a pulpit, he was in a comfy chair on the stage of Rimrock. Watching that man continue to proclaim God and his goodness until his final breath brought so much of God's light into hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of people's lives. In meditating on Joseph and his journey and then looking at Steve and his example through this biblical lens, I am convinced that Steve was able to fight the good fight, to finish his race, to keep his faith. 1 Timothy 4, because of the perspectives that he was able to hang on to. Just like Joseph, he knew that God is king over everything. Therefore, his ways are far better than anything I could ever come up with, and so I need to trust him regardless of what this broken world throws my way. Out of that perspective, Steve had God-given purpose pumping through his veins. Right, you guys remember that? It was so evident up to the end of his life that he knew why he was still there. And it was out of that, right, he was able to continue to push through. And in seeing that, I am convinced there is no better way that I want to live my life. All right, I'm done. Let's I gave Josh just like a one sentence of what I was going to be teaching on, and first service I got to hear the songs that God gave to him. This is an opportunity for us to like really proclaim this truth, to declare that God is king and that he can be trusted. So much of our perspective is what we force it to be, what we talk ourselves into, right? It doesn't mean it's not backed by truth, but it's what we convince ourselves of. So I strongly encourage you now as we sing these songs to do just that. Proclaim it with your heart that God is worth everything that you have. Where are you at?